Okay, so I never know when exactly it starts, so I'm gonna just, okay, I think we should be live now. Hey everyone, my name is Rok, and today I'm representing Youth for Climate Justice for another one of our Fridays talks. And this time we have, of course, as always, some very interesting guests to explore some very topical, topics. And yeah, if we go through the order of presenting, we'll have Mark and Catherine, and yeah, sorry, Thomas. And maybe you guys can say a little bit about yourselves, and then we can go into this. We said for today we'll have a more easygoing exploration of your works, but also apply it a little bit to the Slovenian context.
Great, thank you very much, and thank you everyone who's joining virtually. Can't see directly, but I'm hoping is there, and yeah, thanks for joining, taking the time today. My name is Mark Stoddart. I'm a sociology professor at Memorial University in Newfoundland, Canada. And I guess my connection into this originally was a couple of years ago. Came to Ljubljana for the political ecology summer school at the University of Ljubljana and had a really fantastic time. So when Rok reached out about doing this, immediately jumped on board and all that stuff. So I mostly work in environmental sociology, social movements, political sociology, communications and culture. The main project I've been working on for the last 5 years or so is looking at nature-based tourism on one hand, and offshore oil development on the other as parallel development pathways for coastal societies around the North Atlantic, and how these two modes of development come into contact conflictually or in terms of collaborations or other things. Looking comparatively between Newfoundland and Labrador, Denmark, Iceland, Scotland, and Norway. A big part of that project has also been looking at the role of social movements, environmental movements in particular, and how they intervene in shaping the way that we think about living in coastal places, making a living from coastal places. And we see different ways of conflict and friction sometimes with the oil sector in particular, but also collaboration or alignment with the tourism sector to try and defend a place from resource extraction or oil development, things like that. And then through that project, I've also been getting interested more and more in renewable energy transitions and the sometimes unintended consequences of decarbonization and moving away from fossil fuels. So in my own province, and I think this resonates really well with some of the debates in Slovenia right now, there's a major hydro mega project called Muskrat Falls that's being pitched by the government partly as a way to kind of decarbonize the electricity system of my region. But it has really significant landscape impacts, really significant downstream impacts on mostly indigenous communities in terms of methyl mercury, landscape slope instability, all that kind of stuff. So even in the path of decarbonizing, we see the generation of new risks, new downstream risks, and unintended consequences. So in starting to think a lot about over the last few years, tourism and oil as different ways of living in coastal places, that's also led into a third kind of interest in renewable transitions and throughout all that, kind of the roles that social movements can play in creating friction or helping to steer things in one way or the other. And I'll pass it over to Catherine to talk about her stuff a bit.
Great. Thanks, Mark. And thank you, Rok, for this amazing invitation to be part of this conversation. So I am also an environmental sociologist by training. And a lot of my work focuses on public risk perceptions as well as expert risk perceptions and the difference between the two of them. So I've done most of my research has looked at expert and public risk perceptions in the nuclear industry, as well as in climate change policy. I approach this from the level of organizational cultures and how that shapes expert risk perceptions. And when you really go into the details of that, you also realize that when you compare the ways in which organizational cultures shape expert risk perceptions, and you compare that with the way the public perceives risk perceptions and the cultural factors that influence that, there's actually very little difference. And so that's one aspect of my research. The other thing that I also really focus on in my research is the influence of colonial legacies in developing countries when it comes to shaping public as well as expert risk perceptions. And so, yeah, that's pretty much the field of research that I do. And I look forward to engaging with everybody on the topic of conversation today.
All right. So my name is Tuomas Ylä-Anttila, and I'd like to thank everyone for watching. Thank Rock for organizing this and inviting me. So I'm also a sociologist by training, but currently I am an associate professor of political science at the University of Helsinki in Finland. And so the work I do for the past few years has focused on a social network approach to climate change politics. So we're running a project called COMPON, Comparing Climate Change Policy Networks, where we try to find out about different organizations that get involved in climate change politics in 14 different countries. And we map the collaboration networks of those organizations, and we kind of try to see how it's often argued that okay, it's the political economy, whoever has strong economic resources will be able to control climate change policies. Now, what we are interested in, how does that kind of thing as economic power of someone translate into political power? And our argument is organizations form networks and they collaborate, and that's the kind of power structure that we're looking at. And those structures differ in different countries, they evolve over time, and they have effects on what kind of climate change policies are being put in place in those countries. So that's the main thing I'm working on. We also do work on discourse networks related to climate change. So we're looking at media material and analyze that as networks. A recent project also brings in social media networks and sort of tries to see the three different layers of organizational networks, media discourse networks, and social media networks. So that's the kind of climate change related work I do. In the past, I've also worked quite a bit on social movements, the global justice movement for one, and the many sort of climate related movements that came out of that wave of mobilization. And we're also developing more research on the climate change movement at the moment, but I might say a few words about that later.
Great. Thanks so much, everyone, both for joining and these great introductions. So yeah, we were discussing before the stream that maybe it would make sense to kind of hear each of you give us a little primer, in a more detailed primer into the kind of research angles and interests that you're working on. And yeah, maybe along the way apply it a little bit to Slovenian context, but we really like to hear your stories, because also at the moment there's not a lot of institutional support or education in terms of very interdisciplinary oriented or things like these. And I'm also very grateful for this particular assortment here today, which I guess we have also Mark to thank for bringing us in together in this configuration. I understand you also talk frequently with each other and cooperate. And yeah, I think these topics that you're working on are very timely to discuss in Slovenia, to kind of configure the ways in which we can co-create, yeah, climate and environmental politics and just futures. So we'd give the word to Mark first, and yeah, move on to Catherine. And
Sure. Yeah, and maybe I'll just throw one thing that's come out of a actually completely different research project than I was just mentioning. So like Tuomas was just talking about compounds. So I've been one of the co-leads of the Canadian case, and that's been a lot of our work together. And one of the things we've seen in the Canadian case that might be quite relevant in the current situation in Slovenia is when we did a lot of our media and policy network data analysis, there was a very kind of hostile, very conservative, right-leaning government. The Stephen Harper conservative government was very openly hostile to environmental movements and indigenous-based movements. A lot of extra scrutiny through things like the Canada Revenue Agency, attempts at defunding, stuff like that. And what we found that was kind of interesting was in the media discourse, environmental groups were still actually fairly successful at getting into the media sphere and communicating their claims. They tended to be dominated by the bigger, more mainstream, more well-established organizations, more than grassroots or smaller groups. But the thing we thought was very interesting was even in a very hostile political system where groups had very little political impact or political efficacy, they were actually still fairly successful at breaking into the media sphere and talking to the public, which I think is one thing that was quite interesting in that project. And then the other thing, as I said, it's come out of my more recent research that I think ties in well with what my understanding of the current situation in Slovenia is, that contestation around hydropower, right? And this idea that as we look at mechanisms for moving away from coal, from oil, so on, that often there's a discourse around hydro, nuclear, as well as wind, solar, etc., that these are kind of, you know, the positive alternatives. But I think a really key point that comes out of my energy-oriented research is there is no such thing as innocent energy, right? Whether we're talking about a hydro project that might create pollution issues for downstream fish populations, or just really transform the landscape, or if we start looking at things like wind or solar that often look lighter impact and more benign, but if you go up the supply chain, the minerals that go in to solar panels, to wind power, often come from regions where conflict minerals are an issue. Disposing of waste kind of becomes a big downstream issue. And as we've seen, like in the Nordic region, often the placements of wind farms, for example, if they're onshore rather than offshore, can end up disrupting things like Sami reindeer herding, for example. There've been conflict over that. So, you know, so one thing I've studied a lot is like environmental movement contestation around oil and fossil fuels. But, you know, I don't think we want to just assume that the renewables transition is going to be free of its own points of tension, its own unintended consequences, in terms of ecological as well as equity, right, and as well as social justice. And maybe I'll just leave it there for now with those few ideas that might relate to the current situation in Ljubljana. Yeah.
Slovenia more broadly, yeah, thank you.
Slovenia more broadly, yes, yeah.
No,
yeah.
we have this problem of everything centered in Ljubljana, so we get a lot of kind of.
Right, yeah. I guess mentally I'm in Ljubljana right
yeah,
now.
Okay. So. Of course, yeah.
Yeah.
I guess I will just pick up from there. Okay, so I think I will just focus on the topic, or rather the issue of nuclear energy. So a lot of my research on nuclear energy has been focused on the case study of India. And so I guess I just wanted to make two kind of like two major points that may be relevant to Slovenia. I'm not so familiar with the political and historical context of the country, but what I can say is that from the perspective of a post-colonial country such as India, a technology such as nuclear energy is very often transformed into a political tool by various parties with vested interests, right? And so what I've seen in the case of India is that nuclear energy and the country's nuclear energy policy has been used by different political parties as a tool to win elections. So what we've seen quite often in like, the southern state of Tamil Nadu, for example, when a party wants to win elections, they will be very anti-nuclear, and they will put the blame for a lot of the public problems, public policy issues on the nuclear power corporation, and blame nuclear for everything. But once they win the elections, they then roll back their anti-nuclear rhetoric, and they even then support nuclear energy or support or approve new nuclear power plants being built in various provinces of that state. So the risks of nuclear energy is very often politicized, and all parties, including not just political parties, but also NGOs and civil society, kind of like fall victim to this whole politicization of nuclear energy. And because of that, it's very difficult to have a somewhat pragmatic, depoliticized discussion about the pros and the cons of nuclear energy itself. Especially for a country such as India, which is a developing country. It has huge energy deficit. Its infrastructure is quite weak. There are positive as well as negative arguments for why nuclear energy may or may not be a viable option for that country or even that particular state. But because of the politicization of nuclear energy, it becomes very difficult to have that dialogue and that depoliticized discussion, public discussion about whether nuclear energy is viable or not for the country or even that particular community. So that's one. The other major point that I like to kind of like communicate is that there is also an environmental ambivalence about nuclear energy, right? So what I've seen in the case of India is that there are certain NGOs that have taken such a strong stance against nuclear energy, and spoken on behalf of the communities that are hosting nuclear power plants, that they have locked themselves into a particular position in the discussion, right? So that it makes it very difficult for these NGOs then to really represent the interests of the local communities that they claim to speak on behalf. What I've found when I did interviews with both the directors operating the nuclear power plants in some of the power plants located in the southern states of India, and also then talking to some of the other NGOs that are community-based organizations that kind of like represent the local communities in those areas where the nuclear power plant is hosted. What I found is that the local communities are not opposed to nuclear power plant per se, but they're opposed to the broken promises of the nuclear power corporation, that before the communities gave their approval for these power plants to be there, for example, the nuclear power corporation promised them roads, they promised them new schools, they promised them hospitals, better infrastructure, access to jobs, better access to electricity. So these were the promises made to the local communities before they gave their consent for the power plant to be built. But once the power plant was built, these promises were then broken. They never delivered on better roads. In fact, yes, they built better roads, but the local communities did not have access to them. They didn't get better schools, they didn't get better hospitals, et cetera, et cetera. So the local communities are opposed to nuclear power plant, not because they think it's unsafe, but because the nuclear power corporation have made promises to them and never delivered. So it's really important to understand then what exactly is the risk that local communities perceive of nuclear power plants or nuclear energy, right? So it's not so straightforward. And when you then also compare it to the risk perceptions of the urban public in India, it's again completely different. For them, they're not anti-nuclear per se, but they are anti-nuclear for military purposes. So the energy function of nuclear energy and the military functions of nuclear energy very often get conflated. So it's quite a complex picture. And so I guess the main point is that when you talk about public risk perceptions or expert risk perceptions of nuclear energy, it's not so straightforward that everybody views the risk of nuclear energy in the same way. There are very different risks involved. So yeah.
Thanks so much, Catherine. And I think, yeah, this question of risk and communicating this risk is very timely here. I know our movement gets asked this question a lot of time, like what is our stance on nuclear energy, or specifically the new nuclear project. You know, I have my views as a movement. You know, it's very complicated to kind of, you know, have a unified kind of perspective on this, just for some of the reasons you've outlined. But yeah, I have the feeling we have to, as a society, answer 100 questions together before we can answer that. Although, yeah, I'm personally, you know, well, it's very difficult to say, but yeah, maybe we can touch more on that later on, or if we get some questions from the audience specifically in relation to what's going on here. So I'll give the floor to Tuomas.
Thanks. So I'm going to say two things. One of them is a research finding that's related to what Mark was saying, and another one is sort of a more general point about climate change politics that I think should be relevant for the Slovenian situation as well. So this first research finding that we just came up with, it'll come out soon in a journal called Global Environmental Change. We studied the media coverage of climate change politics in Finland, and we used our policy network data that I mentioned to kind of see who the influential organizations are, and are those same organizations that actually have influence in these sort of covered networks, are they visible in the media? And the result is reflected in the title of the paper, which is called The Quiet Opposition. So what we found is that the situation in Finland is quite different from the earlier situation in Canada that Mark was describing. Here, almost no one is publicly strongly opposed to climate change action. Like, there's very little public industry opposition or anything like that, or there has been very little opposition. But nevertheless, Finland's climate change policy has been pretty bad until very recently. The policies have been very bad. So we kind of tried to solve this puzzle of, you know, no one's opposing strong climate action, but still no strong climate action is taken. What's going on? And we found that in the policy network, there are very influential organizations who actually prefer, they think economic growth is opposed to the idea of climate change or mitigation. and economic growth is more important than mitigating climate change. So there are very strong industry interests, but they kind of remain hidden in from the media discussion. So that's just to kind of make the point that you know, countries may be very different in what they like on the surface, but or what the debate is like on the surface, but oftentimes you find sort of very strong interest group politics below the surface. And this is like, so this is very different from, let's say, the American situation, where in the US the opposition is very much open in the media, and they fund, you know, everyone knows they fund think tanks, and they fund fake scientists to say things about climate change. So that seems to work in the American political culture. In the Finnish political culture, they tend to do it a bit more covertly. But then the second point, which is sort of related to